My name is Olivia Vance, and I am 29 years old. They cut me out of every holiday for 2 years. They took family photos without me, rented a whole venue, and told everyone I caused drama. Then a cousin told me one thing about who funded the entire event, and I had to sit down. My father looked me in the eye in 2022 and told me that a thief did not deserve a seat at a respectable table. He was talking about a vintage engagement ring my sister Chloe claimed I stole to pay off gambling debts I never had. It was a lie so precise and so cruel that it did not just burn the bridge, it nuked the entire landscape. For 24 months, I have been a ghost. I watched from the digital sidelines as they celebrated Christmases and anniversaries without a single text. But today, I am standing in my kitchen in Austin, Texas, looking at a photo of a massive family reunion banner draped across a rustic limestone pavilion. My parents are there beaming, flanked by Chloe in matching navy blue shirts. There are 50 people in that shot, aunts, uncles, even my childhood neighbors, but I am nowhere to be found. They are throwing a grand reunion without me, but what they do not know is that I am the one who paid for the Raw Bar, the live band, and every single matching shirt they are wearing. Before we get into how I found out, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories, but only if this story truly resonates with you. Drop your age and your local time in the comments. I want to know who is listening right now. Now let me take you back to the moment the first notification hit my phone. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was holding a lukewarm cup of coffee when my screen lit up with a group text from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in months. The photos started pouring in. It was a sea of navy blue and artificial smiles. The venue was Glistening Springs, a high-end hill country retreat that cost a fortune to book. I saw my mother Sarah laughing with her sister, her signature pearls gleaming in the Texas sun. I saw my father Bill standing at the head of a long table, his chest puffed out with that boardroom authority he uses to mask his own failures. And there was Chloe, the golden child, looking radiant and innocent, as if she hadn't dismantled my life 2 years ago with a single performance. The anger hit me first, a sharp cold spike in my chest. It was not just that I was uninvited, it was the sheer arrogance of the display. They had spent 2 years telling anyone who would listen that I was unstable, a thief, and a family disgrace. They had erased me from their lives, yet here they were performing the ultimate act of family unity in a place that looked like a movie set. I felt like a stranger looking at my own history. Every person in those photos had been at my graduation. They had been at my soccer games. Now I was just a cautionary tale they whispered about over expensive champagne. I stared at the matching shirts until the blue blurred into a single painful smudge. They looked so happy. They looked so complete. And they looked like they did not have a single regret about the daughter they had left behind. The first conflict erupted before I could even set my coffee down. I scrolled through the messages and saw a comment from my Aunt Janice. She wrote that it was such a blessing to finally have a peaceful event without any of the old drama. We all know who she was talking about. I could almost hear my mother's voice in that comment, the subtle way she primes the relatives to see me as the villain. I felt a surge of indignation that made my hands shake. I wanted to scream into the void of that group chat. I wanted to tell them that the drama was manufactured by the girl standing in the middle of the photo. I wanted to tell them that I had spent the last 2 years working 70-hour weeks in tech marketing, building a life that required zero help from the people currently mocking me. But I knew that words in a text thread were useless. In the Vance house, appearances were the only currency that mattered. If Chloe cried, it was true. If I spoke, it was defensive. I remembered the night the bridge finally collapsed. Chloe had walked into the living room, heaving sobs, claiming her vintage ring was gone from her nightstand. She pointed at me, the daughter who was always a little too independent, a little too vocal about the family's hypocrisy. My father did not ask for evidence. He did not check my room. He just saw his favorite daughter in pain and decided I was the cause. He told me to get out and not to come back until I was ready to confess. I never confessed because there was nothing to confess. I walked out with one suitcase and a heart full of glass. And now seeing them use my absence as a centerpiece for their celebration, I realized that the exclusion was not just a punishment. It was their new favorite hobby. They were not just celebrating a reunion, they were celebrating their victory over me. But the real explosion was about to happen because a second notification was coming, and this one would turn the entire Texas Hill Country upside down. My cousin Marcus was about to send me a photo of the catering invoice, and the name at the top of that paper was going to change everything. To understand the hollow silence of those 24 months, you have to understand the currency of the Vance household. In our world, love was not a feeling, it was a performance. Growing up in a manicured suburb of Dallas, I learned early on that my 4.0 GPA and my varsity soccer captaincy were considered the baseline of existence. They were the expected minimum, the static background noise of a respectable family. While I was sprinting across fields and staying up until 2 in the morning to master calculus, my younger sister Chloe was the main event. She had an artistic temperament, which was the family code for frequent emotional crises that required everyone to drop what they were doing and attend to her needs. My parents, Bill and Sarah, valued two things above all else: absolute obedience and an Instagram-perfect facade that could withstand any amount of scrutiny from the neighbors. If the lawn was trimmed, the cars were washed, and the daughters were smiling in the Christmas card, then life was good. It did not matter what was rotting beneath the surface, as long as the exterior remained flawless. I was the dependable daughter, the one who handled the logistics for every holiday, the one who remembered birthdays and organized the catering for my parents' anniversary parties. I was the invisible engine that kept the Vance machine running until the day I decided to build a life of my own. When I moved to Austin to start a career in tech marketing, my father did not see it as a milestone of independence. He called it running away from responsibility. In his mind, my success was a betrayal because it was not something he could claim or control. Contrast that with Chloe, who dropped out of her third junior college to find herself. Instead of a lecture on accountability, my parents bought her a brand new SUV to encourage her journey. They rewarded her failure because her fragility gave them a purpose, while my competence made them feel obsolete. This was the existing architecture of our family, a delicate balance of the high achiever and the golden child, until Chloe decided she needed a villain to explain her latest setback. The ring accusation was the final piece of their plan for my exclusion. It was a vintage piece, a family heirloom that Chloe claimed disappeared from her nightstand after I visited for a weekend. She did not just say it was gone, she told them she saw me looking at it with greed. She told them she heard I had a secret gambling problem, a complete fabrication that she delivered with the kind of practiced sobs that always made my father reach for his checkbook. They did not check the pawn shops. They did not ask for a single shred of proof or look at my bank statements. My father did not even let me finish my sentence when I tried to defend myself. He simply accepted Chloe's tears as the ultimate truth. It was easier for them to believe I was a thief than to admit their favorite child was a liar. For 24 months, I watched from the digital sidelines as they celebrated Christmases, birthdays, and anniversaries without a single miss you text. I was 3,000 miles away emotionally, even though I was only a 3-hour drive down Interstate 35. I became a ghost in my own family tree. They took photos at the lake house, everyone dressed in coordinated linens, and I was simply edited out. My mother stopped calling to ask for help with her laptop, and my father stopped sending me links to business articles he thought I should read. The erasure was systematic. It was as if they had decided that if I did not exist in their photos, the shame of the accusation did not exist either. I spent my first holiday alone in Austin, eating a frozen dinner and watching the snow fall on my balcony while my phone buzzed with notifications of their grand feast. I saw the turkey, the fine china, and the empty chair where I should have been sitting. But the silence was not just about the holidays. It was about the smaller moments, the way my name vanished from family conversations. My cousin Marcus told me that if anyone mentioned me at a dinner party, my mother would quickly steer the topic toward Chloe's latest pottery class or her new yoga certification. They were building a narrative where I was the troubled daughter who had walked away rather than the one who had been pushed. This pattern of erasure was a slow poison. It made me question my own memories. I started to wonder if I had ever truly belonged at that table, or if I had just been a useful tool. They discarded the moment I became inconvenient. Every time I saw a new post on social media, I felt that sharp, cold rejection all over again. I saw them at the state fair laughing with corn dogs in their hands, looking like the perfect Texas family. There was no sign that a daughter was missing. There was no gap in the line. They had filled the space I left behind with more of Chloe's drama and more of my father's ego. I was only 27 when it started, but by 29, I felt like I had aged a decade. I was living in a vibrant city surrounded by friends and a flourishing career, but the hollow space between my ribs was a constant reminder of the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. The conflict shifted from a sharp pain to a dull, constant ache. I realized that my parents did not just believe Chloe, they needed to believe her. If I was the villain, then they were the long-suffering parents who had done their best. It gave them a story to tell their friends, a way to garner pity while maintaining their status. I started to notice a new trend in the photos Marcus would occasionally send me. They were traveling more, spending more, and the lifestyle they were projecting seemed to be inflating at an impossible rate. My father's firm was successful, but not this successful. I saw photos of a new boat, a renovated kitchen, and finally the announcement of this grand family reunion. The scale of it was staggering. It wasn't just a backyard barbecue, it was a full-scale production at Glistening Springs. As I looked at those photos, a new feeling began to replace the grief. It was suspicion. I knew the numbers. I knew what it cost to maintain that level of luxury, and I knew my father's penchant for cutting corners. I sat in my quiet apartment, the blue light of my phone illuminating the darkness, and I began to wonder where the money was coming from. That was when I noticed a tiny detail in one of the photos, a logo on a gift bag that looked hauntingly familiar. It was the spark that would lead me to the truth. A truth that would prove my family wasn't just celebrating without me. They were thriving on the very life they had stolen from me. The next conflict was already beginning to take shape, hidden in the fine print of a bank statement I hadn't checked in months. What my parents never knew, and what they never bothered to ask during those long months of radio silence, was that the unstable daughter they had discarded was no longer the girl they remembered. While my father was busy telling the neighborhood associations in Dallas that I was struggling to find my feet, I was standing in high-rise boardrooms in downtown Austin, managing a $15 million rebranding project for a global software firm. I did not just survive being cast out. I thrived in the vacuum they left behind. I traded the disgrace they draped over my shoulders for a level of discipline that would have terrified them. I worked 70-hour weeks, fueling myself with black coffee and the kind of cold, sharp focus that only comes when you have absolutely nothing left to lose. I did not do it because I was a workaholic or because I loved the corporate grind. I did it because the silence of my apartment was too loud if I stopped moving for even a second. If I sat still, the echoes of my father's accusations would start to crawl back into my mind, so I chose to outrun them. I built an empire out of the bricks they threw at me. While Chloe was likely still sleeping until noon in her subsidized SUV, I was learning the intricate dance of international market analytics. I developed a reputation for being the person who could handle high-stakes negotiations with a steady hand and a pulse that never spiked. It was a skill I had perfected in childhood, originally used to fix Chloe's messes and navigate my mother's passive-aggressive mood swings. But now, it was a weapon I used to secure my own future. I invested every spare cent into Texas real estate, eventually buying a sleek condo with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lady Bird Lake. I surrounded myself with a network of mentors and colleagues who saw my worth when my own blood refused to acknowledge my existence. These were people who valued my brain, my work ethic, and my integrity. In their eyes, I was a powerhouse, a rising star in the tech scene who commanded respect the moment I walked into a room. To my parents, I was still the thief in the shadows. To the rest of the world, I was the one holding the keys. I had become a woman they wouldn't recognize. My wardrobe changed from the safe, modest clothes my mother picked out to sharp, tailored suits that reflected the steel in my spine. I spoke with a clarity and authority that came from knowing I was the only person on earth I could truly rely on. I had created a life that was unfiltered and real-built brick by brick with my own hands. I did not need a graduation check or a family trust to pay my mortgage. Every square inch of my home, from the Italian marble countertops to the original local art on the walls, was a testament to my own resilience. I had effectively erased the version of Olivia they tried to preserve in their lies. But despite the accolades and the growing bank account, that hollow space between my ribs still ached every time a family holiday rolled around. It is a strange kind of torture to be successful and completely alone. I would stand on my balcony at night, looking at the city lights, and wonder if they ever felt a pang of guilt, or if their Instagram-perfect life was truly enough to sustain them. I told myself I was fine. I told my friends I was beyond them, that I had moved past the need for parental validation. I practiced the lie until I almost believed it myself. I would tell people at cocktail parties that I wasn't close with my family because our values didn't align, which was a polite way of saying they had replaced me with a fairy tale. But then the reunion photos hit my phone, and the carefully constructed walls of my Austin empire began to tremble. Seeing them all together at Glistening Springs proved that the lie they were living was still a weapon pointed directly at my heart. They weren't just moving on, they were rewriting the past to exclude me entirely. In those photos, they looked like a family that had never known sorrow, like my name had never even been a footnote in their lives. The limestone pavilion, the matching shirts, the sheer scale of the event. It was a performance of wealth and unity that felt like a slap in the face. It wasn't just the exclusion that burned. It was the realization that they were using my absence as a tool to bond with one another. I could imagine the conversations happening around those tables. They were likely sharing stories about how much more peaceful things were, now how they didn't have to walk on eggshells around my drama. They had turned my trauma into their tranquility. As I scrolled through the images, my eyes kept returning to my father. He looked so proud, so in control, as if he had personally financed this entire spectacular weekend. I knew his business was doing well, but Glistening Springs was a different level of opulence. It was the kind of place where you paid for the privacy as much as the view. I looked at the catering, the premium bar, the professional decorations, and the math just didn't add up. My father was many things, but he was never one to overspend on others if it didn't directly benefit his ego. I felt a new kind of conflict brewing, a sharp suspicion that cut through the initial grief. There was something off about the luxury on display. My marketing brain started analyzing the branding of the event. I saw the custom-printed gift bags and the high-end gift sets that every guest seemed to be carrying. I recognized the quality of the materials. It was the kind of work my own firm specialized in. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in my condo. A memory flickered in the back of my mind. A legal document I'd signed years ago when I first started my consulting business, a time when I still trusted my father enough to let him help me set up my initial corporate structure. I had been so eager for his approval back then that I hadn't questioned why he insisted on being listed as a secondary authorized user for emergency purposes. I sat back on my sofa, the blue light of the phone screen casting long shadows against my walls. The pride I felt in my success was suddenly eclipsed by a growing sense of dread. If my parents were telling the world I was a failure while I was lead managing multi-million-dollar projects, what else were they hiding? I had spent 2 years becoming a ghost, but I was starting to realize that ghosts can still be haunted. I reached for my laptop, my fingers hovering over the keys of my business banking portal. I hadn't checked the secondary subsidiary accounts in months, the ones I used for minor freelance contracts and old legacy projects. The silence in my apartment felt heavy, like the air before a Texas thunderstorm. I was about to go looking for the truth, and a part of me knew that once I found it, the bridge between me and my family wouldn't just be burned, it would be completely obliterated. My cousin Marcus was about to call with the missing piece of the puzzle, and the explosion that followed would make the ring accusation look like a minor misunderstanding. The next conflict wasn't just coming, it was already inside the house. 3 hours after that first notification shattered my quiet afternoon, the phone in my hand began to vibrate. I did not even need to look at the screen to know who it was. Marcus was the only person in the entire Vance family who had ever dared to look past the manicured hedges and the polished silver to see the rot underneath. He was the one who had sent me books when I was exiled, and the only one who didn't hit the block button the moment my father gave the order. I swiped the screen and the sound of a distant bluegrass band spilled into my kitchen, muffled and distorted, followed by the sound of heavy, panicked breathing. It sounded as if he were running or hiding. "Olivia, are you there?" Marcus whispered. His voice was so low I had to press the receiver against my ear until it hurt. He sounded terrified, his words coming out in short, jagged bursts. I asked him if he was okay and where he was. "I am in the upstairs bathroom at the pavilion," he said, and I could hear the click of a lock sliding into place. "This is insane, Olivia. You have no idea. There is a raw bar with jumbo shrimp from the coast, a 4-piece live band, and your dad is currently standing on a limestone stage, giving a speech to 50 people about family integrity and the importance of a clean legacy. He is literally talking about how the Vance name is a brand that must be protected from stains." I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. My father, Bill Vance, was a man who worshipped his own reputation like a god. Yet here he was using my absence as the primary example of what happens to those who do not fall in line. But Marcus was not calling to give me a play-by-play of the hypocrisy. "Olivia, I need you to listen to me very carefully," he said, and I could hear the sound of him leaning against a door. I was downstairs near the service entrance looking for more napkins when the event planner stepped away to handle a cooling issue with the wine. She left her tablet and a folder of invoices open on the back table. I looked at the catering contract, Olivia. I saw the primary sponsor listed at the top. I felt my grip tighten on the phone until my knuckles turned white. I expected him to say it was my father's firm or perhaps a loan they had taken out to keep up appearances. Marcus took a shaky breath, a sound of pure disbelief that made the hair on my arms stand up. "The event is not being paid for by your dad or his company," he said. "The primary sponsor listed on the contract is Vance Marketing Solutions, and the billing address is your condo in Austin." The air in my kitchen suddenly felt like it had been sucked out by a vacuum. I felt my knees give way, and I had to sit down right there on the cold tile floor. I stopped breathing for what felt like a minute. Vance Marketing Solutions was the small consulting limited liability company I had set up years ago for my freelance projects. It was the entity I used to manage my private clients and my real estate investments. My father had mocked it when I first told him about it, calling it a glorified hobby and a waste of time for someone with my lack of business instinct. Yet according to Marcus, that hobby was currently bankrolling the most expensive party my family had ever thrown. "How is that possible, Marcus?" I managed to choke out. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation that didn't involve the ultimate betrayal. He told me the signatures on the digital authorizations were electronic, but they were definitely tied to my corporate tax identification number. He had seen the routing digits on the final payment notice. It was my money. It was my 70-hour work weeks, my late-night market analyses, and the blood, sweat, and tears I had poured into my career while they were calling me a failure. They were eating premium seafood and dancing to a live band on my dime, all while telling the relatives that I was too unstable to be trusted with a seat at the table. Marcus told me he had to go because he heard my father calling for him downstairs. He hung up, leaving me in a silence that was far more terrifying than the noise of the party. I sat on the floor, the shadows of the late afternoon stretching across the kitchen like long dark fingers. The shock was being replaced by a cold, sharp fury that I had never felt before. This was not just a lie about a ring. This was a systematic financial execution. My father was not just a narcissist. He was a predator who had found a way into my life even after he had kicked me out of it. I thought back to the background of my business. When I first started Vance Marketing Solutions, I was 21 and still desperate for my father's approval. He had offered to help me with the initial paperwork, claiming that as a seasoned business owner, he knew how to navigate the Texas regulatory systems better than I did. I remember sitting in his office in Dallas feeling so grateful that he was finally taking my ambitions seriously. He had insisted on being listed as a secondary authorized user on the legacy accounts, the ones we set up for emergency medical use or long-term tax planning. He told me it was a safety net, a way for him to protect me if something ever went wrong. I had signed those documents with a smile, believing that a father's protection was the one thing in the world that was truly unconditional. I realized now that he had been playing the long game. He had waited until I was successful enough to be worth robbing, and then he had used that safety net to hang me. He had used his access to bridge the gap between his dwindling firm and the lifestyle my mother demanded. Sarah Vance was a woman who could not breathe if she wasn't the best-dressed person in the room, and Bill was a man who would commit any sin to keep her from seeing him as a failure. They had chosen to sacrifice me twice. First, they took my reputation to give Chloe a scapegoat for her own mistakes. Now they were taking my future to buy a few hours of social standing in the hill country. The conflict was no longer about being uninvited. It was about theft on a grand corporate scale. I looked at the photos Marcus had sent earlier, seeing the smiling faces of the people who had erased me. Every one of them was an accomplice in my mind now. They were all participating in a fraud, whether they knew it or not. I stood up from the kitchen floor, my legs shaking, but my mind crystal clear. I needed to see the numbers for myself. I needed to see exactly how deep the knife had gone. I walked to my home office, the blue light of my monitors reflecting in my eyes. I opened my business banking portal, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I bypassed my primary operating accounts and went straight to the subsidiary ledgers, the ones I used for old legacy projects and minor consulting fees. I had moved most of my capital to high-yield investments months ago, but I still kept a significant balance in the original accounts for tax purposes. I clicked on the transaction history and felt the world tilt on its axis. There were dozens of them. Transfers of $5,000, $10,000, and finally a massive $20,000 wire labeled as a venue deposit. They were all directed to something called the Vance Legacy Trust. I had never heard of it. I dug deeper, tracing the digital footprint of the authorizations. My father had used the power of attorney I had signed at 21 to create a secondary link between my business and this trust. He had done it quietly, a few $1,000s at a time, testing the waters to see if I would notice. And I hadn't. I had been too busy lead managing $15 million rebranding projects to notice that $85,000 had been siphoned out of my own accounts. The anger was so intense, it felt like a physical heat radiating from my skin. I wasn't just a marketing analyst anymore. I was a victim of white-collar crime committed by my own parents. I looked at the total at the bottom of the screen, $85,000. That was more than some people made in 2 years. It was my security, my hard work, and my peace of mind, and they were currently spending it on a raw bar and matching Navy shirts. A new conflict was rising, one that involved legal ramifications and potential jail time. I realized that if I didn't act immediately, he would drain the accounts dry before the reunion was over. He was likely planning to use the rest of the money to pay off the debts he had accrued, keeping Chloe in luxury SUVs and my mother in designer pearls. I reached for my phone, my finger hovering over the contact for the Austin Police Department, but I paused. A criminal report would be the end of everything. It would be a permanent public stain on the Vance name that even my father couldn't spin. But then I thought about the way he had looked at me in 2022. I thought about the way he had told me I was a thief in front of the entire family. He had already destroyed my name. Why should I protect his? I felt a cold, calculated sense of justice take over. I was going to shut him down, but I was going to do it in a way that ensured he felt every bit of the shame he had forced me to carry for 2 years. I didn't call the police, not yet. Instead, I dialed the number for my attorney, Jessica. She was the one person who knew exactly how to dismantle a man like Bill Vance. As the phone rang, I looked out the window at the Austin skyline, the lights of the city beginning to twinkle in the dusk. The Vance family wanted a reunion, and I was going to give them one. I was going to show up at Glistening Springs, not as the disgraced daughter, but as the woman who held the deed to their entire lifestyle. The next conflict was about to move from the digital world to the limestone pavilion, and the explosion was going to be heard all the way to Dallas. I was done being a ghost. I was ready to be the reckoning. I spent the next hour in a fever of digital detective work, my laptop screen the only light in my darkened Austin condo. I bypassed my primary operating accounts and began scouring my corporate credit cards and the automated billing systems I had established for my high-end clientele. On the surface, everything appeared normal. The numbers balanced, and the recurring revenue from my software rebranding projects flowed in like clockwork. But a persistent cold instinct told me to look deeper into the corners of my professional life I had long since automated and forgotten. I navigated to a subsidiary account. I rarely checked a small legacy portal I had originally opened nearly a decade ago to help my mother Sarah with her disorganized bookkeeping. It was supposed to be a bridge, a way for me to teach her financial independence, but it had become a backdoor I never thought to lock. I found the first leak buried under the label of miscellaneous professional fees. It was a transfer of $4,000 dated 6 months ago, then another for $8,000. As I scrolled, the amounts intensified, culminating in a massive $20,000 wire marked as a venue deposit. All of them were directed to an entity I didn't recognize, something called the Vance Legacy Trust. I felt the air leave my lungs as the total flashed at the bottom of the ledger, $85,000. My father, Bill Vance, had been systematically siphoning my professional earnings to fund their spotless lifestyle and this Grand Hill Country reunion. Using an old power of attorney I had signed when I was 21, and naive, he had turned my success into a private ATM for the very people who had erased me. The irony was a jagged blade that cut through every remaining shred of my composure. He was not just excluding me from the family, he was making me pay for the privilege of my own erasure. The premium raw bar where my aunts were currently grazing the limestone pavilion where the band played, and those matching navy blue shirts they wore as a uniform of unity, were all bought with my 70-hour work weeks. They were celebrating family integrity, using the resources of the daughter they had branded a criminal. I sat back, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes, realizing that every smile in those reunion photos was funded by my sweat and my stress. My father had stood on that limestone stage and talked about a clean legacy while standing on a foundation built with stolen money. This discovery triggered a memory of the day I signed that power of attorney. I was a college senior sitting in his mahogany-paneled office in Dallas, feeling a rare moment of connection. He had told me that a woman in business needed a safety net, someone who could step in if a contract went sideways or an emergency struck. He made it sound like a rite of passage, a graduation gift of parental protection. I remember the scratch of the fountain pen on the heavy bond paper and the way he smiled as he tucked the document into a locked drawer. I thought it was an act of love. Now I realized it was a long game, a contingency plan for the day his own firm couldn't support my mother's designer habits and Chloe's endless demands. Bill Vance was a man who viewed himself as a titan of industry, but his real talent was maintaining a facade of wealth while the rafters were rotting. He couldn't stomach the idea of the neighbors at the country club seeing a smaller guest list or a cheaper venue. To him, my success was not a source of pride but a harvestable asset. If I wasn't going to be the obedient daughter who lived under his thumb, I would at least be the silent financier of his public theater. I looked at the transaction history again, noting how the withdrawals perfectly timed with Chloe's European vacation and the renovation of their kitchen. They had been living off me while telling the world I was a failure who couldn't be trusted with a family heirloom. The conflict shifted from a daughter's grief to a CEO's cold fury. This was white-collar fraud disguised as a family matter. My professional reputation was built on my ability to spot discrepancies and manage multi-million-dollar budgets, yet I had been blind to a predator in my own bloodline. I began to wonder if the ring accusation had been a tactical move rather than a sister's whim. If I was alienated and silenced, I was less likely to look closely at those old accounts. By making me a ghost, they had ensured I stayed in the shadows while they picked my pockets. The depth of the calculation made my skin crawl. It wasn't just greed, it was a coordinated execution of my character to protect their comfort. I dug further into the Vance Legacy Trust, tracing the digital footprint to a private bank in Dallas. The primary authorized user was my father, but the secondary was Chloe. My sister, the one who couldn't balance a checkbook or hold a job for 6 months, had been a co-beneficiary of my stolen earnings. She was likely using my money to pay the insurance on that SUV my parents claimed they bought her as a reward for finding herself. The theft was circular and complete. Every person in that photo at Glistening Springs was an unwitting accomplice to a crime that had stripped me of $85,000 in 6 months. I felt a new tension rising, a sharp awareness that I was currently at a crossroads. I could call the bank and report the fraud, which would lead to a quiet investigation and a likely attempt at a settlement. Or I could take the path my father had taught me, the one where appearances are everything, and a public fall is the only true punishment. He had used a microphone to tell the family I was a thief. It seemed only fitting that I use one to tell them the truth. I realized that if I didn't stop the flow of money immediately, he would drain my remaining tax reserves to pay for the final catering bill and the luxury gift bags I saw in the photos. I reached for my phone, but I didn't dial my parents. I called Jessica, my attorney whose firm specialized in high-stakes litigation and corporate disputes. When she answered, I didn't lead with my feelings. I led with the transaction IDs and the power of attorney. I told her I needed an immediate freeze on the trust and a formal revocation of all parental access to my business entities. I could hear her typing on the other end, the sound of illegal machinery starting to grind. She asked me what I wanted to achieve. I looked at the photo of the raw bar again, at the jumbo shrimp and the crystal ice sculptures. I told her I wanted them to finish their dinner, but I wanted to be the one who delivered the final bill. As I spoke to Jessica, a new conflict emerged. She warned me that my father would likely claim the money was a gift or a pre-existing family arrangement, using the power of attorney as a shield. He would spin it as a misunderstanding, a father managing his daughter's affairs for her own good. To win, I couldn't just have bank statements. I needed to catch him in the act of claiming ownership of my success. I needed him to stand on that stage and tell one more lie in front of everyone. Only then would the legal and social collapse be total. I felt the battle lines being drawn across the Texas landscape. The silence of my kitchen was now filled with the hum of a plan. I wasn't just Olivia the analyst anymore. I was a woman reclaiming her legacy. I started a new spreadsheet itemizing every expense I could identify from the reunion photos. The Limestone Pavilion, $3,000. The Bluegrass Band, $5,000. The Raw Bar, $7,000. I was building a dossier of their hypocrisy cent by cent. I knew my father would think he was untouchable behind his hill country gates, but he forgot that he had raised a daughter who knew exactly how to track a trail of breadcrumbs. I stood up and walked to my floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the Austin skyline. The city looked vast and indifferent, but I felt a strange sense of belonging to it. This was the place where I had built my worth, and it was the place where I would defend it. I realized that the next 24 hours would decide if I would spend the rest of my life as a victim of the Vance family narrative or the author of my own. I had 85,000 reasons to fight, and for the first time in 2 years, I didn't care about being a respectable daughter. I cared about justice. I reached for my car keys, the weight of the decision final. I was going to Glistening Springs, and I was going to make sure that the next family photo included the one person they never expected to see. The reckoning was no longer a possibility. It was a scheduled arrival. My father had spent my money to buy a stage, and I was going to be the one who closed the show. I did not cry. I did not scream. I felt a cold, clinical clarity settle over me, the same battle mode I used when a high-stakes corporate merger was going south, and I was the only person in the room who knew how to save it. For years, my family had mistaken my competence for compliance, but they were about to learn that the girl who fixed their messes had become a woman who dismantled empires. I stood in my kitchen, the blue light of my laptop reflecting in the darkening glass of my balcony, and I felt a switch flip deep inside my chest. The daughter who wanted to belong was gone, replaced by the executive who demanded accountability. I reached for my phone and dialed Jessica, a sharp-eyed attorney in Austin who specialized in white-collar fraud and high-net-worth asset protection. She was the kind of woman who wore silk scarves and spoke in a voice that sounded like velvet over gravel, but she had a reputation for being a shark in the courtroom. When she answered, I did not lead with the heartbreak of the reunion or the exclusion. I led with the numbers. I told her about the $85,000, the Vance Marketing Solutions tax identification number, and the Vance Legacy Trust. I told her about the power of attorney I had signed at 21, a document intended for emergencies that had been turned into a weapon of theft. Jessica did not gasp. She did not offer empty platitudes. I heard the frantic click of her keyboard as she pulled up the public filings for the trust. "This is a mess, Olivia," she said, her tone professional and focused. "He didn't even try to hide the paper trail. He assumed you would never look." Within 2 hours, she had the preliminary paperwork drafted. We had a formal notarized revocation of the power of attorney, an immediate emergency freeze on the Vance Legacy Trust, and a formal demand for a full accounting of every cent siphoned from my business over the last 6 months. "We can handle this quietly, Olivia," Jessica suggested, her voice softening for the first time. "We can send these documents to his office on Monday morning. We can freeze the funds and negotiate a settlement without anyone else ever knowing. You can get your money back without the public spectacle." I looked at the photo Marcus had sent, the one of my parents and Chloe smiling in the Texas sun, matching in their navy blue shirts, while standing on a limestone stage I had unwittingly paid for. I saw my father Bill holding a champagne glass and looking like the patriarch of a flawless dynasty. "No," I said, my voice steady and devoid of the tremors that usually plagued my conversations with him. "They want a family reunion. They have spent 2 years telling everyone I am a thief and a failure, while they used my sweat to buy their shrimp and their status. I am going to give them a reunion they will never forget. I was not going to show up at Glistening Springs as a victim begging for a seat at the back of the pavilion. I was going to show up as the owner of the table. The conflict in my heart was no longer between love and hurt. It was between the past and the future. My father had spent 30 years teaching me that the Vance name was a brand, a legacy that had to be curated and polished at any cost. He had sacrificed my reputation to protect his favorite daughter's feelings, and now he was sacrificing my future to protect his own comfort. He believed he was the only architect in the family, the only one who knew how to build a world. He had no idea I had been building my own world for 7 years, and his was just a small, poorly constructed room inside of it. I booked a car service for the 3-hour drive from Austin to the hill country. I didn't want to be exhausted from the drive or frustrated by the traffic on Interstate 35. I wanted to arrive with the same lethal focus I brought to a rebranding launch. I packed my leather portfolio with the legal documents, the bank statements, and the evidence of the embezzlement. I tucked them inside like a concealed weapon, the heavy cream paper a physical weight against my hip. As I dressed, I thought about the background of my battle mode. I had learned it from him. I remember being 12 years old and watching my father fire a contractor who had overcharged him by $50. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene. He had simply sat the man down, presented him with the itemized receipts, and told him exactly how his reputation in Dallas would be destroyed if he didn't make it right. My father had taught me how to be a predator, never realizing that one day I would turn those lessons back on him. But the conflict was escalating beyond a simple legal dispute. I knew that showing up would mean the end of my mother's peace. Sarah Vance lived for the approval of the country club set. She lived for the moments when she could tell her friends about the successes of her children. To her, this reunion was the pinnacle of her social year. If I walked into that pavilion and tore down the curtain, I wasn't just exposing my father, I was destroying her world. A part of me wanted to protect her, to keep the illusion alive for the sake of the woman who used to braid my hair before soccer games. But then I remembered her silence. I remembered the 2 years of Christmases where she hadn't called. I remembered how she had looked away when my father called me a thief. Her peace was built on my silence, and I was no longer willing to pay that price. I called Marcus back and told him to stay in the pavilion, to keep his eyes open and his phone charged. I told him I was on my way. He sounded terrified, but there was a spark of excitement in his voice too. He was the one who had seen me as an equal when we were kids, the only one who didn't care about the ranking system my parents enforced. I knew that by involving him, I was putting him in the line of fire, but he was the only bridge I had left. The drive was a blur of rolling hills and oak trees, the landscape of the Texas hill country turning gold as the sun began its descent. I sat in the back of the black sedan, the leather interior smelling like expensive air and old secrets. I felt a new conflict rising, a sharp awareness of the permanence of what I was about to do. Once I badged into that venue, once I presented those papers, there would be no going back. I would be the woman who sued her own father. I would be the one who officially broke the Vance legacy. The logic of American society is built on the idea of the self-made individual, but it is also obsessed with the sanctity of the family. I was about to pit those two values against each other in the most public way possible. My father thought his status as a parent gave him a permanent license to exploit my success. He thought that because he had provided the baseline, he owned the ceiling. He was wrong. In this country, the one who signs the checks holds the power, and for the first time in my life, that person was me. I checked my watch as the car turned onto the long, winding driveway of Glistening Springs. 4 o'clock. The golden hour. The time when my parents would be at their most confident, basking in the glow of their coordinated finery. I looked at the portfolio in my lap, feeling the sharp edges of the truth through the leather. I wasn't just Olivia Vance, the marketing analyst. I was the reckoning. I was 85,000 reasons for them to be afraid. As the car slowed to a halt in front of the rustic chic gates, I saw the sea of navy blue shirts in the distance. The live band was playing something upbeat and traditional, the sound of a fiddle carried on the breeze. I felt my pulse steady, my breathing deep and controlled. I stepped out of the car, my heels hitting the gravel with a sound like a gavel. The conflict was no longer hidden in the fine print of a digital ledger. It was here in the limestone, and the sunlight waiting to be resolved. I walked toward the pavilion, the weight of my success and my anger fueling every step. My father had bought a stage with my money, and I was about to show him exactly who was the lead in this drama. The final bill was coming, and I was the one who was going to collect. The car pulled up to the Glistening Springs venue at exactly 4 p.m. The timing was deliberate. This was the golden hour, that specific window of Texas sunlight that turns every blade of grass into a shimmering asset, and every limestone wall into a monument of success. It was the moment my parents would have meticulously scheduled for their family portraits, ensuring the lighting masked every wrinkle and every lie. As the black sedan hummed to a stop, I caught my reflection in the tinted window. I had chosen a tailored white suit for this occasion, a sharp architectural silhouette that stood in stark contrast to the soft navy blues I knew my family would be wearing. This suit cost more than the sedan my father currently drove, and it was a physical manifestation of the authority I had earned in the high-stakes world of Austin tech. I was no longer the daughter who adjusted her posture to fit their expectations. I was the person who owned the room. I stepped out of the vehicle, the dry heat of the hill country hitting me like a physical wall. The scent of cedar and expensive catering wafted through the air. At the stone entrance, a young woman in a black vest stood behind a mahogany podium clutching a tablet as if it were a shield. She looked at me with the practiced politeness of high-end hospitality. "Name, please," she asked, her finger hovering over the digital guest list. I watched her eyes scan the screen, moving past the Vances, the cousins, and the longtime family friends. I knew she wouldn't find me. My name had been scrubbed from this narrative 2 years ago. "I am not on your guest list," I said, leaning in just enough to let her see the gold-embossed business card I placed on the podium. Olivia Vance, CEO of Vance Marketing Solutions. The girl blinked, her brow furrowing as she looked from my face to the business card. "I am sorry, ma'am, but if you are not on the list, I can't let you through. This is a private family reunion." I didn't move. I simply gestured toward the clipboard tucked under her arm, the one holding the physical backup of the master invoices. "Check the primary billing contact on the catering and venue contracts," I said, my voice as level as a horizon. "You will find that Vance Marketing Solutions is the sole entity responsible for the raw bar, the live band, and the very podium you are standing behind. In fact, I am the one paying your salary for the evening." The young woman's face went through a rapid transformation from confusion to dawning terror. She shuffled through the papers, her hands trembling slightly, until she found the signature page. She looked at my name, then at the Austin business address, and then back at me. She stepped aside with a frantic, awkward nod, the gate swinging open to allow the ghost back into the house. I walked toward the main pavilion, my heels clicking against the limestone path with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. The sound of a bluegrass quartet filled the air, the bright, upbeat notes of a fiddle mocking the cold fury in my chest. I had apparently hired them to provide the soundtrack for my own betrayal. The pavilion was a masterpiece of rustic opulence, draped in white linen and lit by flickering lanterns that mirrored the emerging stars. It was beautiful, expensive, and entirely fraudulent. I saw the matching navy shirts, now a sea of blue that felt like a uniform of complicity. Every aunt, uncle, and cousin was here, laughing and clinking glasses, completely unaware that the daughter they whispered about was the one providing their entertainment. I saw my mother first. Sarah Vance was standing near a massive floral arrangement, her signature pearls gleaming as she laughed at a neighbor's joke. She was the picture of suburban grace, the woman who had taught me that a well-set table could hide 1,000 sins. She looked happy, she looked peaceful. It was the look of a woman who had successfully pruned her life of anything inconvenient. Then she turned. Our eyes locked across the expanse of the limestone terrace. The laughter died on her lips as if it had been strangled. Her hand jerked and her wineglass nearly slipped from her manicured fingers. She didn't move. She just stared at me, her face pale under the expensive bronzer, as if she were seeing a figure rise from a grave she had personally dug. The neighbor she had been talking to followed her gaze, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition. "Olivia," he whispered, his voice carrying just enough to alert the nearby cluster of relatives. The ripples of silence began to spread through the pavilion like a shockwave. I didn't stop. I kept walking toward the center of the terrace, my eyes never leaving my mother's face. I saw the moment the panic set in, the way her gaze darted toward the far end of the pavilion, where my father was likely holding court. She was looking for a protector, a way to spin this intrusion before it ruined the lighting of her perfect evening. But I wasn't there to play a role in her script. I was there to reveal that the script was written on a stolen ledger. As I moved closer, I saw my father, Bill Vance, emerge from the shadows of the bar. He was wearing the same navy shirt as the others, his chest puffed out with the unearned pride of a man who thinks he has won. He saw me, and his jaw tightened, his face turning a deep, mottled red. He began to march toward me, his hands balled into fists, his boardroom authority ready to crush the daughter he had spent 2 years branding as a thief. He didn't know that I had the receipts for every shrimp on the buffet and every note the band was playing. The conflict was no longer a digital trail or a whispered rumor. It was standing in the middle of a limestone pavilion in the Texas Hill Country, illuminated by the setting sun. The relatives were starting to gather at the edges of the terrace, their hushed conversations creating a low buzzing static that felt like the hum of an electric fence. I could see Chloe near the buffet, her face going through a series of expressions from shock to calculated victimhood. She was already preparing her tears, reaching for the mask of the wounded sister. But I had my own mask now, one made of professional success and legal documentation. I felt the weight of the portfolio against my side, the physical evidence of 85,000 reasons why this reunion was a crime scene. My father reached me first, stopping only inches from my face. His breath smelled of expensive scotch and unadulterated arrogance. "Olivia," he hissed, his voice low but vibrating with a violence he couldn't quite mask. "You are not welcome here. I told you what would happen if you showed your face without an apology. You are embarrassing this family. Get out before I have the staff escort you to the gate." I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to shrink. I didn't feel the need to explain my innocence or beg for a chance to be heard. I felt the power of the person who holds the bill. I leaned in, my voice calm and clear enough for the closest relatives to hear. "That is an interesting choice of words, Bill," I said, using his name for the first time. "Because according to the venue staff, I am the only person here with the authority to escort anyone anywhere. After all, I am the one who paid for this stage. And I think it is time the family saw the real performance you have been putting on." My mother reached us then, her hand trembling as she touched my father's arm. "Bill, please," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the crowd. "Everyone is watching." This was her greatest fear, the crack in the porcelain, the public admission that the Vance family was not a monolith of virtue. I looked at her, at the pearls I had likely paid for, and I felt a cold, sharp clarity. "You should have thought about the audience 6 months ago, Mom," I said. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have a speech to give." I stepped past them, heading toward the microphone stand at the center of the pavilion. The next conflict was about to be broadcast to every person in that sea of navy blue, and there wasn't a lie in the world big enough to stop it. The golden hour was over, and the reckoning had arrived. The bluegrass music did not stop immediately, but the atmosphere around the central family table shifted as if the air had been replaced by ice. 50 heads began to turn one by one as the white silhouette of my suit cut through the sea of coordinated navy blue. My father, Bill Vance, stood up with a speed that nearly upended his chair, his face reddening with a fury he usually reserved for failing contractors or insubordinate employees. He moved to intercept me before I could reach the cluster of aunts and uncles who were already whispering behind their champagne flutes. "Olivia, what are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice low but vibrating with a violence he could barely contain. "I told you clearly that, until you apologize to your sister for that ring, you are not welcome at any family functions. You are trespassing, and you are embarrassing your mother." I did not stop walking. I did not even look at him. I bypassed his outstretched arm and moved with the clinical precision of an executive toward the center of the pavilion. I headed straight for the microphone stand where the band leader was tapping a fiddle, preparing to announce the next set of traditional hill country tunes. The man looked at me, saw the tailored white suit and the sheer authority in my eyes, and stepped back without a word. I reached for the mic, the cold metal feeling like an anchor. "Excuse me," I said, my voice amplified by the high-end professional speakers I had unknowingly rented with my own sweat. The sound echoed off the limestone walls, a sharp crack that silenced the fiddler and the chatter of the crowd. 50 people froze. I saw my Aunt Janice drop her appetizer onto her silk lap. I saw the neighbors I had known since I was 5 years old shift uncomfortably, their eyes darting between me and the red-faced man currently marching toward the stage. And then I saw Chloe. She was standing by the buffet, a plate of jumbo shrimp in her hand, her face drained of every drop of color. As the spotlight of the pavilion's lanterns caught her, her hand went instinctively to her right hand, her fingers curling over the vintage engagement ring she was wearing. It was the very ring she had claimed I stole to pay for a gambling addiction that never existed. She realized her mistake a second too late, her eyes widening with the dawning terror of a performer who had just forgotten her lines in the middle of the climax. I looked out at the assembled Vance legacy, and felt nothing but a calm, devastating sense of purpose. For 2 years, these people had been told I was a thief. They had been told I was the drama, the unstable element that had to be purged to keep the family unit healthy. I saw the pity in some eyes and the judgment in others. I remembered every soccer game my father had skipped to attend Chloe's rehearsals. I remembered every science fair where I stood alone with a ribbon while my mother helped Chloe pick out a dress for a middle school dance. This was the architecture. They had built a world where my success was a threat, and Chloe's lies were the foundation. But today the architect was holding the microphone. "I am sorry to interrupt the festivities," I told the crowd, my voice steady and clear, devoid of the desperation I used to feel when begging for their attention. "I know you were all told that I was not invited because of my choices. I know you were told that I am the stain on this family's reputation. But as the person who actually signed the checks for this raw bar, this limestone pavilion, and the very band you were just dancing to, I thought I should at least say a few words." A collective gasp rippled through the audience, a wave of shock that was followed by an even deeper silence. My father reached the edge of the stage, his hand slamming onto the limestone. "Get off that stage, Olivia," he roared, the mask of the respectable businessman finally shattering. "You are delusional. You haven't contributed a cent to this family in years. You are a thief who lives in a world of fantasy." I didn't flinch. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out the first page of the itemized bank statements, holding it up so the front row could see the corporate headers. "That is an interesting claim, Bill," I said, looking down at him. "Because Vance Marketing Solutions, my company in Austin, has been the sole source of funding for the Vance Legacy Trust for the last 6 months. Unless you are telling me that you found $85,000 in the couch cushions, you might want to explain to our guests why your signature is on the digital authorizations for my business tax identification number." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't just shock. It was the sound of a structural failure. My mother Sarah had reached the front of the crowd, her hand pressed against her pearls, as if she could keep her world together by sheer force of will. "Olivia, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not here. Not in front of everyone. Think of the family." "I thought of the family for 27 years, Mom," I replied, the microphone catching the cold edge of my words. "I thought of the family when I fixed Chloe's car after her third accident. I thought of the family when I stayed up all night doing your bookkeeping so you wouldn't have to admit to Dad that you were overspending. I thought of the family every day for the last 2 years while you all pretended I didn't exist. Now I am thinking of the truth. The drama was no longer a private dispute. It was a public execution of a lie." I saw the cousins whispering, their heads bobbing as they looked at the papers in my hand. My father tried to scramble up the steps of the stage, but Marcus stepped into his path. My cousin didn't say anything. He just stood there, a solid block of navy blue, blocking the man who had been the king of our world for decades. It was the first time I had ever seen anyone in this family stand up to him, and the shift in power was palpable. The next conflict was already clawing its way to the surface. As I looked at Chloe, I saw her face change. The victimhood was being replaced by a sharp, calculating anger. She realized that the ring on her finger was the smoking gun, and she was already looking for a way to hide it. She knew that if she could get to the microphone, she could still spin this as me being the aggressor. She began to move toward the stage, her tears starting to flow on cue, her voice rising in a wail that was designed to trigger my father's protective instincts. "Olivia, you're hurting them!" she cried, her voice carrying across the pavilion. "You're just mad because you failed and we succeeded. You're making this up because you're jealous of my happiness." I felt the crowd waver. Chloe's tears had a 20-year track record of winning. Some of the older relatives began to look at me with renewed suspicion, the old narrative of the dramatic daughter trying to claw its way back. I realized that bank statements were not enough to break her hold on them. I needed to show them the real Chloe, the one who didn't just tell lies, but who actively hunted for ways to destroy me. I reached into my portfolio for the second document, a set of internal communication logs from my father's own firm that Jessica had managed to flag just before I left Austin. These were the papers that proved the ring accusation wasn't a mistake. It was a strategy. The level of drama in the room was reaching a breaking point. The band members were backing away toward the edge of the pavilion, their instruments forgotten. The caterers had stopped serving, standing like statues with trays of uneaten hors d'oeuvres. My father was screaming at Marcus. My mother was weeping into a silk handkerchief, and Chloe was inches from the stage, her hand reaching for the mic. I felt the surge of adrenaline that comes when you are about to deliver the final, undeniable blow. They wanted a show, and I was about to give them the encore they never saw coming. The Vance legacy was about to meet its real owner, and the bill was finally due. I pulled the itemized accounting from my leather portfolio with a steady hand. My father likes to talk about family integrity, I said, my voice projecting clearly through the speakers and cutting through the humid Texas air. I looked directly at Bill Vance, whose jaw was working frantically, as if he were trying to physically chew the words that might indict him. But I think it is time we actually discuss financial integrity. Over the last 6 months, exactly $85,000 has been transferred from my personal business accounts to fund this reunion and my parents' lifestyle. These were transfers authorized by an old power of attorney I was told was reserved for emergency medical use only. I paused, letting the weight of that number sink into the ears of every relative standing in a navy blue shirt. A collective gasp rippled through the limestone pavilion, a physical wave of shock that seemed to rattle the glassware on the tables. My mother Sarah covered her mouth with her trembling hand, her eyes darting toward the relatives as if she could pull the information back out of their ears. I did not give her the chance. I began reading from the ledger, my tone precise and clinical. March 14th, $5,000 for a landscaping overhaul at the Dallas house. April 2nd, $12,000 for a kitchen renovation. May 20th, $20,000 as a venue deposit for this very pavilion. June 5th, $15,000 for a luxury SUV lease payment. I read the dates and the amounts with an undeniable rhythm, a countdown of their greed that left no room for interpretation. I saw my Aunt Janice, the family moral compass, and a woman who prided herself on her career and education, shift her gaze. She looked at my father with a sudden sharp disgust that was more powerful than any insult I could have hurled. The narrative was shifting right in front of my eyes. I was no longer the thief who had stolen a vintage ring. I was the victim of a sophisticated familial embezzlement. I watched the Vance perfection crumble in real time under the heavy weight of my bank statements. The polished exterior of their lives was cracking, revealing the hollow, desperate theft that had been keeping them afloat while they publicly mocked my name. To truly understand why this betrayal felt like a jagged blade, you have to realize that my father had built his entire identity on being the provider. He was the man who had the answers, the one who handled the complicated paperwork, so we wouldn't have to worry. Growing up, I saw him as a titan who kept our world safe. When I signed that document at 21, it was an act of total, uncritical devotion. I believed a father was a person who protected his child's future, not someone who treated it like a personal piggy bank. He had taken that trust and turned it into a financial crime, banking on the idea that I would be too busy or too intimidated to ever audit my own history. But he had underestimated the very discipline he had forced me to develop. By pushing me out, he had forced me to become the master of my own ship. I had spent 2 years becoming an expert in market fluctuations and corporate transparency. I knew how to track a dollar through 3 different offshore accounts if I had to. He had raised a wolf and expected her to remain a sheep. As I continued reading the list, I saw the neighbors backing away from my parents, creating a physical gap on the limestone terrace. The social currency they worshipped was devaluing by the second. The drama was no longer about a missing ring or a family dispute. It was a forensic report on the death of a reputation. My father tried to step toward the microphone again, his face a mottled shade of purple, but the crowd was no longer on his side. He looked like a man caught in a spotlight he couldn't turn off. "You gave that money to the family." "Olivia," he shouted, his voice cracking with a desperation that made the relatives flinch. "It was a contribution." We took care of you for 20 years. You owe us everything." I looked at him, and the pity I felt was quickly replaced by a renewed sense of justice. "Taking care of a child is a responsibility, Bill, not a loan with an $85,000 interest rate," I replied. "And you did not ask. You took. You used a document meant for my health to buy a raw bar and a new kitchen. That is not a contribution. That is a felony." The conflict was escalating beyond the pavilion. I saw my mother whisper something to my father, her face a mask of pure terror. She knew that Aunt Janice was already pulling out her phone, likely to call other family members who hadn't made the trip. The news of the embezzlement would reach Dallas before the sun fully set. The matching navy shirts now looked like a joke, a costume for a play that had just been canceled. But even as the financial truth settled over the crowd, I saw a new tension brewing at the edge of the stage. Chloe was no longer crying. She had seen the way the wind was blowing, and she was shifting her strategy. She realized that if my father went down for embezzlement, her own lifestyle would vanish along with his reputation. She stepped forward, her eyes narrowed, her hands still clutching the shrimp plate as if it were a weapon. "You're lying!" she yelled, her voice shrill enough to make the speakers hum. "You forged those papers. You're just trying to ruin Dad because you're a failure. You've always been jealous of us." I looked at my sister, the girl who had spent her entire life being shielded from the consequences of her actions. She really believed that a loud enough lie could overwrite a bank statement. I realized that the financial betrayal was only half of the story. To truly clear my name, I had to address the lie that had started this exile in the first place. I had to address the ring. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I prepared for the next move. I wasn't just here to take back my money, I was here to take back my life. The guests were now fully engaged in the spectacle, their initial discomfort replaced by a morbid curiosity. They were witnessing the total collapse of the Vance dynasty, and none of them wanted to miss the final blow. I turned the page in my portfolio revealing the high-resolution photo Marcus had sent of Chloe's hand from earlier that day. The conflict was about to shift from the ledger to the heirloom, and the explosion was going to be deafening. I looked at Chloe at the vintage ring gleaming on her finger in the lantern light, and I knew that her time as the golden child was officially over. The next conflict wasn't just coming, it was already standing on the stage, ready to burn the last of their lies to the ground. I turned the spotlight of the entire pavilion toward my sister, her face already slick with the first few beads of a cold sweat. "And then there is the matter of the ring," I said, my voice dropping an octave until it carried the weight of a funeral bell. The crowd shifted a collective lean toward the truth. Chloe tried to retreat, her shoulders hunching as she sought shelter behind a massive limestone pillar, but 50 pairs of eyes followed her every movement like a spotlight. "The ring Chloe claimed I stole to pay for a gambling addiction I have never had." I continued, my gaze locked onto her trembling form. "The heirloom that was allegedly lost in 2022. The very reason my father told me I was no longer a daughter." I reached into the inner pocket of my white blazer and pulled out a high-resolution photo that Marcus had texted me earlier that morning. It was a crystal-clear shot taken during a pre-reunion lunch at a bistro in Fredericksburg. It showed Chloe's hand resting on a wine glass, and there, gleaming under the Texas sun, was a vintage band with an unmistakable emerald-cut diamond. It was a ring that looked identical to the stolen heirloom. I held my phone up to the microphone, the screen projecting the image as I zoomed in on the intricate filigree. "Interesting how a stolen treasure found its way back to your finger, Chloe," I said. "Did you happen to find it in the gambling den you told Dad I visited? Or was it always tucked away in your jewelry box, waiting for the perfect moment to get me out of the way?" Chloe let out a sharp, jagged gasp that echoed through the professional speakers. For 20 years, she had been the master of the performative sob, the kind of heaving, heart-wrenching display that could make a jury weep. She tried to go for it now, her knees buckling slightly as she clutched the edge of the buffet table. She burst into tears, her face scrunching into a mask of pure agony as she wailed about how I was attacking her on the happiest day of the family's year. She looked toward our father, her eyes pleading for him to step in and silence the mean sister. Usually, this was the moment where Bill Vance would charge in like a white knight to protect his fragile flower. But this time, nobody moved. My father stood frozen, his eyes darting between the photo on my screen and the hand Chloe was desperately trying to tuck into the pocket of her navy dress. The silence in the pavilion was absolute, a heavy, suffocating pressure that made the bluegrass band look like they wanted to vanish into the floorboards. To understand why this moment felt like the breaking of a spell, you have to realize that Chloe's fragility was our family's primary religion. From the time she was 5 years old and tripped over a garden hose, the world had to stop for her. If she failed a test, the teacher was unfair. If she lost a friend, the friend was a bully. My parents had built a fortress around her, and the price of admission was believing every word she said. I was the one who paid that price more than anyone. I was the one who stayed up all night doing her homework so she wouldn't have a breakdown, only for her to tell our parents I was bossy and controlling. She had learned that she could occupy the highest ground simply by being the loudest victim. But victims don't usually wear the evidence of their supposed tragedy to a luncheon. I walked toward the edge of the stage, my heels clicking on the stone with a sound that felt like a countdown. "Why are you hiding your hand, Chloe?" I asked, my voice soft but lethal. "If that isn't the ring, then just show everyone. Tell them it is a costume piece. Tell them you bought a replica because you missed the original so much. Give us one more story." I watched her eyes dart around the room looking for an exit, but the cousins had moved to block the perimeter. They were no longer the background actors in her play. They were the audience at her trial. Even my mother, who had spent decades drying Chloe's tears, remained still, her hands gripped so tightly together that her knuckles were the color of salt. The conflict was no longer about money or invitations. It was about the fundamental nature of our reality. Chloe had lived in a world where she could rewrite the past at will. She had convinced my father that I was a degenerate gambler to hide the fact that she had crashed her SUV while distracted and needed a scapegoat to keep her insurance from skyrocketing. She had used that ring as a prop in a theater of cruelty that cost me my home and my family. And now the prop was around her finger, dragging her down like an anchor. "You're a monster," Chloe choked out between sobs, her voice losing its melodic quality and turning into a shrill, desperate rasp. "You're making this up. You photoshopped that. Dad, tell her she's crazy. Tell everyone she's sick." My father didn't move. He looked like a man who had just realized he had been worshipping a false god for 2 decades. The logic of his world was built on the idea that I was the problem. If I wasn't the problem, then he was the man who had abandoned his successful daughter for a liar. That was a truth his ego couldn't survive. I looked at my sister and saw the mask finally slip. The tears didn't stop, but the expression behind them was one of pure, unadulterated venom. She realized that the heaving sobs weren't working. The relatives weren't rushing to her side with tissues and comfort. Aunt Janice was looking at Chloe's hand with a squint that could peel paint. The neighbors were whispering their words, a low hum of judgment that Chloe couldn't drown out. The Vance perfection was dead, and Chloe was the one holding the smoking gun. The silence grew even deeper, if that was possible. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a total collapse. I felt a strange sense of relief, a weight lifting from my shoulders that had been there since 2022. I wasn't the crazy one. I wasn't the thief. I was just the person who waited for the truth to catch up. But even as Chloe's power evaporated, a new and more dangerous conflict was emerging from the wreckage. My father finally took a step toward Chloe, but he wasn't reaching out to comfort her. He was looking at her hand, his face a mask of dawning horror. He realized that if the ring wasn't stolen, then the $85,000 he had taken from my account wasn't just a father helping a daughter in trouble. It was a common thief stealing from a professional woman to fund a liar's lifestyle. The legal and social consequences were crashing down on him all at once. He turned toward me, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Not the fear of a father losing a child, but the fear of a man realizing he was about to lose everything he valued. The next conflict was already taking shape in the way he gripped the edge of the table. He was cornered, and a cornered man like Bill Vance does not go quietly. He was about to try one last desperate pivot, a move that would attempt to shift the blame from Chloe's lies to my own success. He was going to try to make me the villain for being too smart to be fooled. I saw him take a deep breath, his chest swelling with a final burst of artificial authority. He was about to speak, but I was already one step ahead of him. I had one more document in my portfolio, one that would prove that the $85,000 was only the tip of a very large and very dark iceberg. The family reunion was about to become a deposition, and the final revelation was going to make the ring look like a minor detail. I stood my ground on the limestone stage, the owner of the bill and the author of the ending. The show was far from over. My father finally found his voice, but the sound that came out of him was nothing like the booming authority I had grown up fearing. It was cracked, thin, and desperate, the sound of a man watching his empire of cards catch fire in a high wind. He stepped toward the base of the stage, his face no longer red with anger, but a sickly ashen gray. "We did it for the family. Olivia," he shouted, his hands trembling as he gestured vaguely toward the 50 relatives standing in stunned silence. "We were in a hole. Your mother and I were struggling, and we knew you were doing well in Austin. You have so much and your sister has so little. Why must you be so selfish about a few dollars when your own blood is drowning?" It was the ultimate admission, the twisted logic of a dysfunctional family that I had spent 29 years trying to navigate. In my father's mind, my competence was not a source of pride, it was a resource to be harvested. Because I was capable, because I was disciplined, because I had built a career from nothing, I was considered an open vault for their mismanagement. Because Chloe was struggling, a word they used to mask her laziness and her chronic dishonesty, her lies were excused as survival mechanisms. They had decided that my success belonged to the collective, while their failures were my burden to carry. I looked down at him from the limestone stage, and for the first time, I did not see a patriarch. I saw a small, frightened man who had traded his daughter's soul for a reputation he could no longer afford. "I have so much, because I work 70 hours a week, Dad," I replied, the microphone catching the sharp, jagged tremor of nearly 3 decades of suppressed hurt. "I have so much because I spent my weekends in high school studying while you were taking Chloe to theme parks. I have so much because I did not wait for a handout or a legacy trust. I built it, I earned it, and you did not ask for help. You did not come to me like a man and admit you were in trouble. You stole. You manipulated a legal document I signed in good faith when I was a child. You lied to every person in this room to justify why I was not here, all while you were using my sweat, my late nights, and my professional stress to buy their admiration." I looked out at the sea of matching navy blue shirts, and I felt a sudden violent wave of nausea. Every person standing there was wearing my labor like a costume. The fabric on their backs, the shrimp in their mouths, the very ground they stood on was a product of my exhaustion. My father had spent $85,000 of my money to buy a few hours of being the big man in the hill country. He had rented the affection of his relatives with stolen capital. I saw Aunt Janice take a step away from my father, her expression one of pure, unadulterated coldness. She was a woman who had taught 3rd grade for 40 years and believed in the sanctity of the hard-earned dollar. To her, there was no greater sin than a man who robbed his own child to fund a party. My father looked around the room, his eyes darting from face to face, searching for a single ally, a single person who would nod and say that family comes first, even if it means theft. He looked at his best friend from the Dallas Rotary Club, a man he had known for 30 years. But the man turned his head away, suddenly very interested in the texture of the limestone wall. He looked at my mother, but Sarah Vance was a shell, her eyes fixed on the floor as she realized that the country club set would have this story by breakfast. The silence was his judge and jury. The Vance perfection was not just cracked, it was pulverized. This was the man who had grounded me for asking about my own future, This was the man who had stood in a hallway and told me I was a disgrace because I wouldn't confess to a crime I didn't commit. He had used the moral high ground as a sniper's nest for years, picking off my self-esteem whenever I got too close to the truth. But now the ground had opened up beneath him. He was standing in the dirt, and the daughter he had tried to bury was the one holding the shovel. I realized that his defense was not about family at all. It was about his inability to exist in a world where he was not the hero. He would rather be a thief in the name of family than a failure in the eyes of his peers. Chloe tried to speak, then her voice a high, frantic squeak. "It's not a crime if we're a unit," she cried, still trying to cling to the wreckage of their narrative. "We're the Vances. We share things. That's what we do." I turned my gaze to her, and the look in my eyes made her stop mid-sentence. "We don't share things." "Chloe," I said. "You take things. You took my reputation. You took my peace of mind. And now you've taken $85,000 of my career. You aren't a unit. You're a parasite." The drama in the pavilion had reached a point of no return. There was no apology that could fix this, no check that could be written to mend the fabric of what had been torn. I saw my father's shoulders slump, the last of his artificial posture evaporating. He looked old. He looked small. He looked like the thief he was. But as I prepared to step down from the stage, as I prepared to walk away from the ashes of my old life, I saw a movement at the back of the pavilion. A man in a dark suit was walking toward us, a leather briefcase in his hand, and a look of grim professional duty on his face. It was a process server, but he wasn't there for the papers I had brought from Austin. He was looking for my father, and the document he was holding had a seal I recognized from my own corporate dealings. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had triggered the freeze on the accounts, but this was something else. This was an external force, a conflict I hadn't even invited yet. My father saw the man, and for the first time that evening, the gray in his face turned to a ghostly white. He knew what was in that envelope. He had been hiding more than just my $85,000. The relatives began to murmur again, the tension spiking to a new, terrifying level. My mother let out a small, stifled sob as the man reached the edge of the terrace. "Bill Vance." The man asked, his voice echoing in the quiet pavilion. My father didn't answer, but the silence was enough. The man handed him a thick packet of papers, the words summons and complaint visible even from where I stood. I looked at the header of the document. It wasn't from a bank. It was from the state of Texas. The next conflict was unfolding before I could even make my exit. My father wasn't just stealing from me. He was embroiled in something much larger, something that involved his entire firm and the very legacy he claimed to be protecting. I stood on the stage, the papers in my own portfolio, feeling suddenly like just one chapter in a much longer book of crimes. I realized that by exposing the $85,000, I had accidentally pulled the thread that was going to unravel his entire existence. The family reunion was no longer a trial. It was the scene of a catastrophic collapse. I looked at the sea of navy blue at the shrimp and the bluegrass band, and I knew that the bill was much higher than I had ever imagined. The real truth was about to come out, and it was going to make the ring look like a drop of water in the middle of an ocean. My father turned to look at me, and in his eyes, I saw the final desperate realization that he had nowhere left to hide. The final act was beginning. I signaled to the back of the pavilion where the shadows of the oak trees were beginning to stretch across the limestone floor. A figure emerged from the golden haze of the setting sun, followed closely by a man in a dark, nondescript suit who carried himself with the heavy, unblinking focus of a predator. It was Jessica, my attorney, and she was not arriving for a family dinner. She was the vanguard of a reality my parents had spent their lives trying to outrun. "This is not just a family dispute anymore, Bill," I said, dropping the title of father entirely. The word felt foreign and unnecessary, now a relic of a life I had finally outgrown. "This is a criminal matter." I watched the man in the dark suit approach the stage, his footsteps echoing in the absolute silence of the hill country evening. I have already frozen every account tied to my tax identification number. I continued, my voice projected with the cold, flat precision of a court reporter. The Vance Legacy Trust is empty as of 10 minutes ago. I took back what was mine before you could spend another cent on this performance. And these, I said, gesturing to the thick blue-backed folders the process server was pulling from his briefcase, are the formal filings for a civil suit and a comprehensive report to the authorities regarding the systematic misuse of a power of attorney. My mother let out a small, broken wail, a sound like a bird hitting a window pane. She collapsed into one of the rental chairs, her signature pearls clashing against the navy blue fabric of her shirt. The Vance family perfection was officially dead, not with a bang, but with the crisp, dry sound of legal paper being handed to a man who had forgotten that rules apply to everyone. My father did not reach out to comfort her. He stared at the envelope in his hand, as if it were a poisonous snake, his fingers twitching against the heavy bond paper. He looked up at me, and for a split second, I saw the flicker of the man who used to teach me how to ride a bike, but it was quickly swallowed by the hollow, desperate shell he had become. The process server did not stop at my father. He turned toward the buffet, his gaze locking onto Chloe. She was still frozen by the shrimp tower, her hand clutching her plate so hard her knuckles were white. He handed her a separate, slender envelope. "This is for you, Chloe," I said, my voice carrying over the sound of the wind through the cedar trees. "It is a subpoena regarding the false statements you made in 2022. You told the world I was a thief and a gambler to cover your own tracks. You damaged my professional reputation to buy yourself a few years of grace. In the state of Texas, that has a specific name and a very specific price. I was no longer the daughter causing drama. I was the person enforcing the law. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the air in the pavilion felt thin. To understand why I was willing to go this far, you have to realize that in modern American society, your reputation is your only true currency. My father had spent 30 years building a brand based on integrity while simultaneously teaching me that the law was something you navigated rather than respected. He thought that being a parent gave him a lifetime exemption from the consequences of his actions. He believed that the Vance name was a shield that would protect him from the very daughter he had trained to be a shark. The bluegrass band had long since stopped playing. The quartet stood awkwardly at the edge of the stage, their instruments held like useless props. They were witnesses now, along with 50 relatives and neighbors, to the total and irreversible dissolution of a dynasty. I saw my Aunt Janice looking at the process server with a grim, nodding approval. She was a woman who believed in the ledger of life, and she knew the math was finally being settled. The neighbors, the ones who had spent 2 years whispering about the disgraced Olivia, were now looking at Bill and Sarah with a mixture of pity and profound embarrassment. The social execution was complete. Chloe finally broke the silence, but it wasn't with a sob. She ripped the envelope open, her eyes scanning the legal jargon until she found her name. "This isn't fair!" she screamed, her voice shrill and ugly in the quiet night. "You're our sister. You're supposed to protect us. You're rich, Olivia. You have everything. Why do you care about some money and a stupid ring? You're a monster for doing this to your own family." She threw her plate of shrimp at the floor, the ceramic shattering against the limestone, a perfect metaphor for the mess she had made of our lives. I looked at her, and I felt nothing but a cold, distant clarity. "I did protect you, Chloe," I said. "I protected you for 27 years. I fixed your messes. I did your work, and I let you take the credit. But you didn't want a sister. You wanted a servant who would pay for the privilege of being abused. You thought my success was a communal pool you could swim in whenever you felt like it. You were wrong. My wealth is not a family resource. It is the result of the life I built while you were busy trying to destroy me." The conflict was escalating beyond the personal. I saw my father look at Jessica, his eyes narrowing as he tried to find a loophole, a way to spin this as a misunderstanding. "This is a mistake, counselor," he said, his voice trying to regain its boardroom bass. My daughter is emotional. We had an agreement. I helped her start that company. I have a right to those funds. Jessica didn't even blink. She stepped forward, her heels echoing on the stone. Mr. Vance, I suggest you stop speaking immediately. We have the digital footprints of every transfer. We have the revocation of the power of attorney that was never legally updated to include personal lifestyle expenses. And most importantly, we have the recorded testimony from the venue staff that you claim to be the sole financier of this event. That is fraud, plain and simple. My father's face went from red to a terrifying translucent white. He realized then that I hadn't just brought a lawyer. I had brought an architect of his ruin. He looked at the 50 people in navy blue, his loyal subjects, and he saw that they were already moving away from him. The sea of blue was parting, leaving him and my mother standing alone in the center of the pavilion. The prestige he had stolen my money to buy had evaporated in less than 30 minutes. He was a man with a fancy shirt and a handful of lawsuits standing in a room full of people who would never trust him again. But as I prepared to turn my back on them, as I prepared to walk away from the wreckage of the Vance legacy, I saw a movement near the service entrance. 2 men in windbreakers with yellow lettering on the back were walking toward the bar. They weren't process servers and they weren't venue staff. They were investigators from the Texas State Comptroller's office. My heart skipped a beat. I had called Jessica to handle my private theft, but it seemed the state had been watching my father's firm for a completely different reason. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My father hadn't just siphoned $85,000 from me because he was greedy. He had done it because he was desperate. He was hiding a much larger deficit, a hole in his company's books that went back years. By triggering the audit of my business accounts, I had accidentally opened a door that he had kept locked for a decade. The next conflict wasn't just a family matter. It was a corporate collapse that was going to make national news. I stood there, the white of my suit gleaming in the moonlight, realizing that I hadn't just reclaimed my money. I had accidentally pulled the trigger on the end of his world. I looked at the man who had raised me, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of the ending. The bill wasn't just $85,000. The bill was everything. I turned back to the crowd of aunts, uncles, and cousins, their faces a blur of navy blue and absolute bewilderment. The power of the microphone felt heavy in my hand, a scepter of truth that had finally dismantled the throne of lies. I offered them a thin, professional smile, the kind I usually reserved for competitors I had just outperformed in a bidding war. The bar is officially paid for until 6 p.m., I said, my voice projecting with a chillingly calm resonance. Please enjoy the jumbo shrimp and the premium scotch. It was very expensive, and since you have all spent the last 2 years believing I was a thief, you might as well enjoy the spoils of my hard work. I placed the microphone back onto its stand with a deliberate click that echoed through the silent pavilion. I walked off the stage, my heels clicking rhythmically against the limestone floor, sounding like a gavel bringing a fraudulent court to order. Every step felt lighter than the one before it, as if I were physically shedding the weight of the Vance family name with every inch of ground I covered. Marcus met me at the edge of the terrace, his eyes wide and his breath hitched in his throat. Olivia, he started, his voice a mix of awe and terror. That was necessary. I finished for him, not stopping my stride. I did not wait for my father to find his breath or for the investigators to finish their initial questioning. I did not wait for Chloe to craft a new performance or for the neighbors to decide which side of the fence they wanted to sit on. I had said everything that needed to be whispered in the dark and shouted in the light. I walked straight back toward the black sedan waiting at the gate, the white fabric of my suit glowing like a beacon against the deepening shadows of the Texas hills. I was halfway to the car when I heard the frantic thud of footsteps on the grass. "Olivia, wait!" my mother cried out. Sarah Vance was running toward me, her signature pearls bouncing against her chest, her face a mask of desperation. Her heels caught in the soft turf, causing her to stumble, but she kept coming. "Please stop. We can talk about this. We are family. We can fix this before it goes any further." I stopped at the car door and turned to look at her. In the fading light, she looked like a stranger, a woman who had chosen the comfort of a lie over the safety of her firstborn daughter. Family is the group of people who show up for you when the world gets dark, Mom, I said, my voice devoid of the anger that had fueled my drive down from Austin. It is the people who believe in your integrity even when the evidence is stacked against you. It is not the people who use you as an exhausted ATM while simultaneously telling the world you are a disgrace to their reputation. You didn't lose a daughter today. You lost a financier. And it turns out, that was the only version of me you ever really valued. But Olivia, the scandal, she whispered, her eyes darting back toward the pavilion where the state investigators were still huddled with my father. What will people say? Our lives are in that house. Our name is all we have. I looked at her and realized she still didn't get it. She was still worried about the seating chart at the country club, while her husband was being questioned for corporate fraud, and her other daughter was holding a subpoena for a 2-year-old lie. I am not responsible for the fire you started, just because I refused to stay inside the burning house, I told her. I opened the car door, the heavy German engineering of the sedan providing a solid, silent barrier between my new life and her collapsing one. I got inside and closed the door, the vacuum seal cutting off the sound of the hill country wind and the high, thin sound of her beginning to cry. As the car pulled away, I looked out the rear window. I saw the limestone pavilion receding into the distance, a glittering island of navy blue vanity, surrounded by the vast, indifferent Texas landscape. The bluegrass band was likely packing up their instruments, and the caterers were probably wondering if they would still be tipped. The conflict of my childhood was over, but a new, more complex tension was taking its place. I was 29 years old, and I had just effectively orphaned myself. I had the money, I had the career, and I had the truth, but the silence in the back of that car was a reminder of the price of freedom. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "Back to Austin, ma'am?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Back to the life I actually built." I leaned my head against the cool leather of the headrest and closed my eyes. To understand the depth of the exit, you have to understand that I wasn't just leaving a party. I was leaving a system. In modern American society, we are told that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred pact that supersedes all other obligations. But the law sees things differently. The law sees contracts' power of attorney and fiduciary duty. My father had relied on the myth of family to shield his crimes, never imagining that I would use the reality of the law to dismantle him. The drive back was a blur of highway lights and dark silhouettes of cattle and oil rigs. I thought about the $85,000. I thought about the ranch house my father had always talked about, the one he claimed he was saving for Chloe's wedding. I wondered now if that property even existed, or if it was just another mirage in the desert of his ego. The betrayal felt like a phantom limb, a dull ache where a sense of belonging used to be. But beneath the ache, there was a growing sense of power. I had stood my ground. I had protected my legacy. I had looked the predator in the eye and refused to be prey. As the Austin skyline began to twinkle on the horizon, my phone buzzed in my lap. It was a text from Jessica, my lawyer. "Olivia, you need to see this," it read, followed by a link to a news alert. I tapped the screen and felt the air leave my lungs for the second time that day. The headline wasn't about a family dispute or a hill country reunion. It was about a major investigation into a Dallas-based construction firm that had been funneling state funds into a private trust. My father's firm wasn't just struggling, it was at the center of a corruption scandal that stretched all the way to the state capitol. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. By freezing my accounts and reporting the misuse of my power of attorney, I had unknowingly tripped a silent alarm that the state authorities had been waiting for. My father's theft from me wasn't an isolated act of desperation. It was a desperate attempt to cover a much larger hole in his books before the auditors arrived. I hadn't just reclaimed my money. I had accidentally provided the final piece of evidence the state needed to move in. The family reunion wasn't just the end of our relationship. It was the beginning of a criminal trial that would be covered by every news outlet in Texas. I sat in the dark of the car, the city lights reflecting off the window, realizing that the bridge I had burned was actually a dam. And now the water was rushing through, ready to sweep away everything the Vance family had ever stood for. I was no longer just a daughter or a marketing analyst. I was a key witness in a state investigation. The next conflict wasn't going to be fought in a pavilion or a living room. It was going to be fought in a courtroom under the harsh lights of public scrutiny. I looked at my phone, seeing the missed calls starting to pile up, not just from my parents, but from reporters and former associates. The great exit had turned into a global entrance. I wasn't going back to my quiet life. I was going into the eye of a storm I had inadvertently created. I took a deep breath, adjusted my blazer, and prepared for the next act. The bill wasn't just due, it was about to be audited by the world. The drive back to Austin was the quietest 3 hours of my life. I sat in the rear of that sedan, watching the Texas horizon transform into a bruised palette of deep purple and burnt orange. The rolling hills of the corridor seemed to mirror the turbulence in my chest, yet there was a strange, hollow stillness settling over me. I kept thinking about the $85,000. In the grand scheme of my current career trajectory, that was just a number on a ledger. I could earn that back in a single profitable quarter. It was the capital of my labor, yes, but it was replaceable. What was not replaceable were the 2 years of stolen time. That was a debt no amount of interest or litigation could ever fully satisfy. They had taken 24 months of my youth, my peace, and my sense of belonging. They had let me sit in the dark while they basked in a light I was unknowingly paying for. That kind of theft leaves a permanent scar on the soul that no bank statement can heal. By the time I reached my condo overlooking Lady Bird Lake, the digital fallout had already begun. Within a week, the Vance family reunion photos had been purged from every social media platform. The smiling faces in navy blue shirts vanished as if they had never existed. Marcus called me a few days later with a voice that sounded weary but satisfied. He told me that Aunt Janice had emerged as the unlikely executioner of my father's social standing. She had gone to their house in Dallas and demanded that Bill repay every cent he had siphoned from my business, or she would take the entire Story bank statements and all to the board of the prestigious local charity he had chaired for a decade. Janice was a woman who didn't care about the prestige of the Vance name if it was built on the back of a crime. She saw the theft as a rot that threatened the entire extended family tree, and she was determined to prune it. The collapse happened with a speed that was almost dizzying. Because I had frozen the accounts and revoked the power of attorney, my father's delicate house of cards had no foundation left to stand on. The investigators from the state were digging into his firm's books, but the immediate financial ruin came from his own lifestyle. Without my $85,000 to bridge the gap, the predatory loans he had taken out to keep my mother in pearls and Chloe in luxury vehicles began to default. My parents were forced to sell the 6-bedroom colonial in Dallas, the one with the manicured lawn and the mahogany office where I had signed my future away at 21. They moved into a cramped townhouse on the outskirts of the city, a place where the neighbors didn't know their names and didn't care about their history. The SUV Chloe had used as a reward for her lies was repossessed from the driveway of that new townhouse. Marcus said she screamed at the tow truck driver until the police were called, a final performance of victimhood that had no audience left to applaud. The spotless reputation they had spent 50 years meticulously building had vanished in a single afternoon of truth at Glistening Springs. In modern America, status is a currency that can be devalued overnight by the mere mention of fraud. They were no longer the pillars of the community. They were the people who had robbed their own child. The silence from the country club was louder than any shouting match could have been. They were simply dropped from the guest lists, erased from the committees, and forgotten by the people they had worked so hard to impress. They started sending me letters about a month after the move. I would find them in my mailbox, thick envelopes with my father's familiar, sprawling handwriting. I didn't open a single one. I could guess the content without reading the words. They were likely long, rambling apologies that focused far more on their current financial ruin than on my emotional exile. They wanted me to save them again. They wanted the daughter they had discarded to become the benefactor who would restore their comfort. I took those unopened envelopes and placed them in the back of a junk drawer in my office. I put them right next to the science fair ribbon I had won 18 years ago, the one I had proudly brought home only for my mother to tell me to put it away because Chloe was having a bad day and didn't need to see my trophies. The letters and the ribbon sat together in the dark, a collection of things my parents had never truly valued until it was too late. To understand the weight of this aftermath, you have to realize that I wasn't celebrating their pain. I was simply observing the natural consequences of their choices. For years, my father had told me that the world was a harsh place for people who didn't follow the rules. He just never expected that the person writing the rules would be me. I spent my evenings on my balcony watching the rowing teams on the lake and realizing that the version of Olivia they had tried to crush was the only thing that could have saved them. By cutting me off, they had inadvertently trained me to be the person who would eventually hold them accountable. It was a perfect, tragic irony. The conflict of our shared past was settling into a cold, permanent peace, but a new tension was brewing in my professional life. Because of the state investigation into my father's firm, my own business was being scrutinized. Even though I was the victim, the Vance name was currently radioactive in the Texas business community. I had major clients asking me if my firm was entangled in the Dallas corruption scandal. I had to spend my days in meetings with auditors and PR consultants, proving over and over again that my success was separate from my father's crimes. I was fighting to keep the very empire I had built from being dragged down into the grave he had dug for himself. It was a reminder that even when you walk away from the fire, the smoke can still find you. I was sitting in a meeting with a new tech startup from California, trying to convince them that my marketing solutions were untainted by the headlines when I realized that I couldn't just distance myself from the name. I had to redefine it. I needed to do something that would turn the Vance brand from a symbol of fraud into something else entirely. I felt the old battle mode returning, that sharp clinical clarity that had guided me to Glistening Springs. I wasn't going to let my father's ghost haunt my boardrooms. I was going to use the ruins of his legacy to build something that actually had a foundation. As the weeks turned into months, the townhouse apologies stopped arriving. The silence from Dallas became absolute. Marcus told me that Chloe had moved to Houston to live with a friend, still refusing to get a job, and still telling anyone who would listen that I was the villain of the story. My parents were living a quiet, diminished life, the kind of existence they had always feared. They were finally experiencing what it felt like to be invisible. I realized that the greatest punishment for a narcissist isn't prison or poverty. It is being irrelevant. I looked at the junk drawer in my office one last time before I moved to a larger firm in the spring. I saw the unopened letters and the faded ribbon. I felt a strange sense of gratitude for that 18-year-old girl who had kept her head down and worked. She had been building a ladder while they were building a cage. The cage was empty now, and the ladder had taken me to a height they could never reach. But even as I prepared to close that chapter, I received a call from an estate lawyer in Dallas that I didn't recognize. He told me there was a secondary trust, one that had been dormant since before I was born, and it required my immediate signature. The realization hit me that the Vance secrets were not fully unearthed yet. There was a part of my family history that even my father hadn't been able to touch, a legacy that had been waiting for someone with my specific set of skills to unlock. I felt a surge of adrenaline. The aftermath wasn't an ending, it was a transition. I was about to find out that the $85,000 was a drop in the bucket compared to what had been hidden in the dark. The next conflict was about to take me back to the hill country, but this time it wasn't about a party. It was about an inheritance that would change the map of Texas. I stood up, straightened my suit, and walked toward the door. The bill was paid, but the profit was just beginning. 1 month after the dust had settled on the ruins of the Hill Country reunion, I hosted my own dinner party. It was not at a sprawling limestone pavilion, and there was no bluegrass quartet playing folk songs to mask the sound of a crumbling legacy. Instead, we gathered around a long hand-planed wooden table in the center of my Austin condo. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city lights shimmering on the surface of Lady Bird Lake, a reminder that I was finally above the noise and the lies. There were 8 people in attendance, and for the first time in 29 years, every single one of them was there because they chose to be, not because a family hierarchy demanded their presence. Marcus sat at my right hand, looking more relaxed than I had ever seen him. He had officially moved out of the Dallas sphere, cutting ties with the toxic expectations of our upbringing to start a freelance photography business. To his left was Jessica, my attorney, who had become much more than a legal representative over the last few months. She had been the one to walk me through the darkest hours of the state investigation into my father's firm, acting as both a shield and a steady voice of reason. The rest of the table was filled with the mentors and colleagues who had become my found family during the 2 years of my exile. These were the people who had seen my worth when my own blood refused to look me in the eye. They were the ones who had validated my talent and supported my growth, while my father was busy siphoning my earnings to buy a new kitchen for a woman who didn't care about the cost of her comforts. We did not wear matching navy blue shirts. We did not give rehearsed speeches about family integrity or the importance of a clean name. There were no photographers hired to capture the perfect moment for a social media feed that only existed to make others feel inferior. We just ate, laughed, and spoke the truth without the fear of being grounded or branded as unstable. I served a meal I had cooked myself, a simple but elegant spread of Texas-grown vegetables and locally sourced proteins. The atmosphere was light, filled with the kind of genuine warmth that can only exist when there are no secrets hidden under the table. As I watched Marcus laugh at a joke Jessica made about a particularly stubborn deposition, I realized that my father had been right about exactly one thing in his entire life. He used to say that a thief does not deserve a seat at a respectable table. He just had the entire story backward. He had the wrong daughter in mind when he uttered those words. The real thieves were currently sitting in a cramped townhouse on the outskirts of Dallas, trying to figure out how to pay a utility bill without a stolen credit card. The real thief was the man who had traded his child's soul for the approval of a country club set that had already forgotten his name. I looked around my dining room and realized I had finally built a table where I was seen not as a resource to be harvested or a burden to be managed, but as a person. I was no longer a ghost in someone else's play. I was the author of my own narrative. I had learned that the most expensive thing I owned was not the designer suit I wore to Glistening Springs or the sleek car parked in the garage downstairs. It was the peace I had finally purchased with the truth. To understand the depth of this satisfaction, you have to realize that for 29 years, I had been conditioned to believe that my value was tied to my utility. In the Vance household, you were only as good as the problem you could solve or the image you could help project. I had spent my youth being a servant to their ego, convinced that if I just achieved enough, if I just worked hard enough, I would finally earn the unconditional love I saw in the movies. But love is not something you can earn through a balance sheet. Sitting at this new table, I realized that the people here didn't care about my $15 million rebranding projects. They cared about the fact that I liked my coffee too strong and that I had a dry sense of humor. They saw Olivia, not the senior marketing analyst or the disgraced daughter. I felt a surge of quiet power as I raised my glass to toast the people in the room. I was 29 years old, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't anyone's disappointing daughter. I wasn't the girl who caused drama or the thief who stole a ring. I was simply Olivia. The conflict of my identity had finally been resolved. I had stopped setting myself on fire to keep them warm, and in the coolness of my own life, I had finally found the air I needed to breathe. The legal battles were still ongoing, and the state investigation was getting larger every day, but the war for my soul was over. I had won by simply choosing to walk away from a game that was rigged from the start. However, as the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, a final lingering tension remained. Marcus pulled me aside near the door, his expression turning serious. Olivia, I know you think it's over, but I heard from a friend in Dallas that Chloe is trying to sell her version of the story to a local tabloid, he whispered. She's claiming you used your corporate connections to frame Dad because you were jealous of her engagement. She's trying to turn the public against you to save her own skin. I looked at him and felt a flicker of the old anger, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating confidence. She can try, I said. But she forgets that I have the one thing she will never have. I have the receipts. The realization hit me that even though I had built my own table, the world outside was still filled with people like my sister. People who would try to steal the sunlight just because they were used to the shadows. I knew that the next conflict was coming, but I wasn't afraid. I was prepared. I had spent 2 years becoming the kind of person who doesn't just survive an attack, she anticipates it. I walked back to my wooden table, picking up a stray wine glass, and looked out at the city. The lights were a map of my future, and I was ready to navigate every mile of it. Just as I was about to turn off the lights and head to bed, a notification popped up on my laptop. It was an encrypted file from the estate lawyer who had called me earlier, the one mentioned in the aftermath. The subject line read, "Urgent regarding the Hill Country property and the 1970 dissolution." I opened the file and felt the air in the room change. It wasn't a bank statement or a lawsuit. It was a map of a 500-acre ranch, and my name was listed as the sole beneficiary in a trust that predated my father's firm by 20 years. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. My father had spent his entire life talking about the land he was going to leave for Chloe, the property that would define the Vance legacy for generations. He had used it as a carrot on a stick to keep us in line. I realize now that he didn't own a single acre of it. The land didn't belong to him. It belonged to the black sheep uncle he had tried to erase from the family history. And that uncle had seen exactly what I had seen. He had seen the predator in Bill Vance and had decided to skip a generation to protect the only person who shared his steel. The next conflict was no longer about $85,000. It was about a $12 million estate that my father had spent his life pretending was his to give. I stood there in the quiet of my condo, the city lights reflecting in my eyes, and I realized that the ending was not just a dinner party. It was an inheritance of justice. I was about to become the landlord of my father's dreams, and I knew exactly what I was going to do with the keys. The final act was not just about walking away. It was about taking back the ground they thought they stood on. I reached for my phone to call Jessica. The morning was going to bring a new kind of reckoning, and this time the entire state of Texas was going to feel the impact. The table was set, but the feast was just beginning. 6 months after the dust had settled on the ruins of the Vance dynasty, a courier arrived at my Austin office, carrying a package that felt heavier than its dimensions suggested. It was a weather-worn, old-fashioned lockbox from a legacy bank in Dallas, sent by the executor of an estate belonging to a man I had only heard mentioned in hushed, disapproving tones during my childhood. His name was Silas Vance, my great-uncle, and according to the family legend, he was the original shadow on the family tree. He had been the first black sheep a man cut off in 1970 for his own brand of disobedience. In my father's stories, Silas was a cautionary tale of what happened when you refused to follow the Vance blueprint. I sat at my desk, the mid-morning sun, reflecting off the brass latch, and realized that the man they had taught me to fear was about to become the person who set me free. Inside the box was a single, notarized letter and a heavy set of iron keys that felt like they belonged to a different century. As I read the elegant, steady handwriting of Silas's lawyer, my heart stopped. The letter explained that Silas had been watching our family from a distance for decades. He had seen the way my father Bill had curated a life of artificial perfection while marginalizing anyone who didn't fit the mold. Silas had seen himself in me, the child who worked too hard and asked too many questions. The payoff was staggering. Silas had left his entire estate, a 500-acre sprawling ranch in the heart of the hill country, directly to me. This was not just any piece of land. This was a pristine stretch of Texas wilderness that developers had been trying to buy for years to turn into luxury resorts. The kicker, the part that made me let out a sharp, breathless laugh, was the ultimate irony of my father's life. Bill Vance had been the primary legal consultant for Silas's estate for the last 10 years. My father had spent a decade managing the taxes, the land permits, and the environmental surveys for that ranch, convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was the sole respectable heir. He had been so blinded by his own sense of entitlement that he never imagined Silas would bypass him entirely. He had unknowingly been protecting my future inheritance while he was busy siphoning my present earnings. He had spent his professional hours ensuring the value of that land stayed high, believing he was building his own retirement, when in reality he was a glorified caretaker for the daughter he had tried to erase. The ranch was valued at $12 million. I looked at those iron keys and felt a sense of cosmic justice that no courtroom could ever provide. To understand the gravity of this moment, you have to realize that land in Texas is more than just dirt. It is a symbol of permanence and power. My father had spent $85,000 of my money to buy a few hours of prestige in a rented pavilion. Now I owned the very horizon he had always coveted. I didn't sell the land to the developers. I didn't take the easy $12 million and vanish into a life of leisure. Instead, I drove out to the property, unlocked the heavy cedar gates, and stood on the porch of the main house. The air smelled of rain and limestone, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing on ground that couldn't be taken away from me. I turned that ranch house into a sanctuary, a retreat for young professionals and students who had been estranged from their families for the crime of being themselves. I called it the second table. It was a place where people could come to rebuild their lives, find their footing, and realize that their worth was not determined by a seating chart or a parental blessing. We offered business workshops, mental health support, and most importantly, a community that didn't require a mask to enter. I used the very skills my father had tried to weaponize against me to build a foundation for others. I became the mentor I never had, the protector Silas had been for me from across the years. I never spoke to my parents again. I didn't answer the desperate emails that started coming once the news of the inheritance broke. I didn't respond to Chloe's sudden frantic attempts to play the role of the loving sister who just wanted to share in the family's good fortune. They had chosen their path in 2022, and I was simply honoring their decision to live in a world without me. They remained in their small townhouse, living on the meager Social Security payments that were all they had left after the state finished with my father's firm. They were irrelevant, a footnote in a story that had moved on to a much larger chapter, but I did do one thing every year on Thanksgiving. I would walk down to the mailbox at the end of the ranch road and send a single envelope to their Dallas address. Inside was never a check. It was never an invitation. It was a single crumpled $2 lottery ticket. No note, no explanation. Just a $2 reminder of the night they handed me my situation and laughed. I wanted them to remember exactly what they thought I was worth every time they sat down to their diminished holiday meal. I wanted them to know that the daughter they tried to bury had grown into a forest they could no longer see the top of. As I look out over the 500 acres of the second table, I think about that night at Glistening Springs. I think about the navy blue shirts and the bluegrass music. I realize now that the betrayal was the most important thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to stop begging for a seat and start building the entire house. My name is Olivia Vance. I am 29 years old, a CEO, a ranch owner, and a woman who finally knows the difference between a legacy and a lie. In modern America, we are taught that blood is the strongest bond, but I know better now. The strongest bond is the one you forge with the truth. I have my peace, I have my land, and I have a table that is always full. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. If my story resonated with you, if you have ever been the one left out of the photo or told you weren't enough, I want you to know that the ending is yours to write. You don't need their permission to be successful, and you certainly don't need their approval to be happy. Hit like and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories if you want more accounts of people who turned their scars into stars. And before you go, tell me in the comments, what is the one thing you would say to the person who tried to hold you back? I read every single one. Until next time, remember that the bill is always due, and you are the only one who gets to decide how it's paid. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next story. Standing on the edge of my 500-acre ranch, the Texas wind feels different than it did 6 months ago. It no longer carries the weight of a daughter trying to prove her worth to people who were busy picking her pockets. My name is Olivia Vance, and I have finally learned that the most expensive thing you can ever own is the silence of a life built on your own terms. Looking at the iron keys in my hand, I realized that Great Uncle Silas didn't just leave me land. He left me a mirror. He saw the steel in my spine before I even knew it was there, and he ensured that the predator who raised me would spend a decade unknowingly polishing the crown he would never get to wear. The Vance legacy, as my father defined it, is a heap of ash in a Dallas townhouse. But here at the second table, a new legacy is breathing. I watch the sun dip below the hills, casting shadows over the retreat where young people, those who were once told they were the drama or the disappointment, are learning to stand tall. I am no longer a resource to be harvested or a scapegoat for a sister's lies. I am the owner of the horizon. Every Thanksgiving when I mail that single $2 lottery ticket, it isn't out of malice. It is a receipt. It is a reminder that they had a diamond and treated it like a pebble, and now they are left with exactly what they offered me, a gamble with no payoff. Reflecting on this journey, there are 5 lessons I carry with me written in the margins of my bank statements and the dirt of this ranch. First, your competence is not a communal fund. Just because you are capable of fixing everyone's problems does not mean it is your professional or moral obligation to do so, especially for those who wouldn't hold an umbrella for you in a storm. Second, family is a choice, not a DNA contract. Real family is composed of the people who show up in the ICU and the boardroom, not the people who use your name to secure a loan while blocking your number on holidays. Third, always audit your own life, whether it is a power of attorney signed in your youth or the emotional narratives people project onto you. Look at the fine print. Predators rely on your busyness to hide their theft. Fourth, boundaries are the highest form of self-respect. Walking away from a toxic table isn't causing drama. It is enforcing the law of your own well-being. If your absence is the only thing that brings them peace, give them a lifetime of it. Fifth, the best revenge is living a life they can no longer access. You don't need to win an argument with a narcissist. You just need to become so successful and so grounded that their opinion of you no longer reaches your ears. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this reckoning. If my journey from the disgraced daughter to the owner of the second table resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories. We share these accounts because the truth deserves a microphone, and so do you. Drop a comment below with the word legacy if you're ready to start building your own table today. I read every single one of your stories, and I want to know, what was the moment you realized you were worth more than the role they assigned you? Until next time, keep your receipts. Hold your ground and remember, you are the author of your own ending.